Welcome, everyone. There are still, just like in church, there are empty seats up front. So if you'd like to come occupy the seats there. There's food, so please help yourself to the food. Don't be shy. You can get up during the talk and get food if you like as well. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I am a professor here at DePaul and director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, which is sponsoring this event. Thanks for coming. It's really wonderful to see you. I know many of you, but not all of you. If I don't know you, please feel free to introduce yourself and sign up for our mailing list, and we'll let you know about all of the wonderful events that we have coming up. Karen Kraft will talk a little bit about the events that we have coming up immediately after the talk. Karen and Francis Salinel and Anna Kreutz are the people that really kind of make this whole center and these events work, so I want to thank them right away. And I am not going to introduce Father Magesa. I'm going to leave that honor to Father Stan Chu-Ilo, my colleague here at DePaul. Stan was a student of Father Magesa's many years ago, and so they kind of represent different generations of African theologians. Stan is spearheading a project that we have started on African Catholicism, the African Catholicism Project, which is to create a network of African Catholic scholars, and we went over to Nigeria in December to have the first event in the beginnings of this network. We also went to Stan's village and met the Igwe, met the king, Stan's father, and had a wonderful experience there. So it's a cola nut ceremony. We don't have cola nuts tonight. We have sushi instead. But, so Stan, if you would please do the honors.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, and thank you, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to present to you one who is perhaps the most influential, creative, and original African Catholic scholar and priest today. Professor Laurenti Magesa is a household name in Africa and will not need any introduction to most African students of African traditional religion, spirituality, morality, history, or African theology. Even here in the Western world, his book, African Religion, The Moral Traditions of Abundant Life, is still considered a standard reference book for an integrated understanding of how Africans imagine an ethical universe which is able to bring about human and cosmic flourishing. Laurenti Magesa is a priest of the Catholic Diocese of Musoma in Tanzania. He earned his PhD and STD respectively from Ottawa and University of Ottawa and St. Paul University also in Ottawa, both in Ontario, Canada. At present, he is a professor of moral and African theology at Hekima Jesuit School of Theology and Tangaza University College, both in Nairobi, Kenya. He is the author of numerous articles, over 100 of them, and 7 books, and co-author and editor of several other works. His last publication was in 2013, the book titled What is Not Sacred? African Spirituality. Professor Magesa's research interest is in African studies broadly concerned, but especially in areas of ethics, social justice, enculturation, religion and development, as well as politics. Laurenti Magesa is a theologian whose work has reshaped the study of Catholicism in Africa, and for which he has been honored in many parts of the world. Especially last year, he received an honorary doctorate from DePaul University. In the citation for the award, Marisa Alicia, Dean of the School of New Learning here at DePaul, said this of Professor Magesa: Father Magesa has given a groundbreaking voice to the African experience of Catholicism and has inspired scores of students to incorporate their life experiences into their work. Magesa is one of the pioneers of African theology and is truly regarded by many of us as a living ancestor. Hence, you might hear some people call him Muzee or Mwalimu. Mwalimu means actually the teacher, and not so many people earn that title. But also, one thing that touches me profoundly about Professor Magesa is his unassuming approach to life. You know, given his significant accomplishments in life, he just mingles with all of us. And he has been in the trenches. I mean, he has borne the wounds of battle, because it's not as if to say his emergence was without the blows that come with pathfinders, you know, like him. So I am very happy to present to you this evening Professor Magesa, who will be speaking on the topic, naming Jesus as healer in Africa. So I invite you to please join me in giving a rousing welcome to Professor Laurenti Magesa.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Stan, for your very kind, if a little exaggerated introduction. I really appreciate it, and it is a pleasure for me to be here, and I want to sincerely thank the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology for making my presence here possible, especially Bill, Francis, Karen, and Stan. Thank you very much. In the Gospel, according to John, chapter 14, verse 16, Jesus describes himself as the way, the truth, and the life. A very prominent theologian recently remarked, who is European, this theologian is European but has worked in Asia and knows Africa very well. He has remarked that while Asian culture could be said to depict the dimension of Jesus as the way, and Western culture, the dimension of Jesus as the truth, African culture can be said to underline the dimension of Jesus as life. In this presentation, I would therefore like to address this dimension of Jesus as life from the perspective of Africa. Culturally, I'm speaking about Africa south of the Sahara, or what some people call Black Africa. This region, as we might know, is currently marked by a narrative of poverty, ignorance, disease, conflict, and violence. I'm not using the mic. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay.
Not very well.
Not very well?
Not very well.
Not very well. There isn't enough light. My eyes are terrible, so there isn't enough light for me here. That's why I would like to.
Turn the mic on.
Or maybe I could use that mic.
Yeah.
I would therefore like to address the dimension of Jesus as life from the perspective of Africa, culturally Africa south of the Sahara, or Black Africa. This region has a narrative of ignorance, poverty, disease, conflict, and violence, destruction of the environment, and death. So in the current context of Africa, Jesus as life is not only an academic subject of interest, but a serious aspect of theology and of being church in the continent. I have called my reflection Jesus the Life, naming Jesus as healer in Africa, because of two reasons. First, on account of the situation of suffering in Africa that I've just described, and secondly, because of the African cultural expectations, which are principally and deeply founded on the longing for fullness of life. It is my suggestion that unless and until Jesus is named and understood as healer, with all the implications that this image evokes in African Christianity or among African Christians, will the church attain radiant inculturation or incarnation there. Without giving this name to Jesus, the name of Jesus as healer, the understanding of Jesus in Africa will be superficial. I must make it clear from the very beginning that imaging Jesus as healer does not contradict the Christological images in the New Testament. On the contrary, it affirms and confirms them. For in the New Testament, Jesus is nothing if not a life giver, as John chapter 10 verse 10 says. The sense of Jesus as life, or source of life for the world, runs deep throughout the New Testament. The Gospel of John is the richest in this respect, providing some theologically very significant examples. To Martha, Jesus announces that he is the resurrection and the life. And to the woman from Samaria, Jesus equates himself with the water of life or living water, and describes his mission in terms of providing life without end. In African thinking, this is the vocation of the healer, thus naming Jesus as healer. The healer is the individual in African societies who is charged with the responsibility of dispelling the isolation, hopelessness, and fear involved in illness, suffering, deprivation, and death. Thus, the mission of the African healer is like that of Jesus himself, to always call forth new life. This is why I propose that Jesus must fundamentally be imagined and imaged in Africa as life giver or healer, the bringer and protector of life and the opponent of every human adversity. That Jesus adopts Psalm 23's metaphor of the good shepherd to describe his life-giving ministry is extremely significant. So naming Jesus as healer in Africa corresponds to the need to make Christology responsive to the current socio-spiritual context of the continent. This is what theologians like Karl Rahner refer to as the ongoing incarnational task of Christology. For Karl Rahner, repeating old Christological formulations in new contexts will not do. As John McIntyre puts it, the crisis of meaning and functionality evident in current Christological formulations can only be resolved by a radical reassessment of the basic shape of this central doctrine of the Christian faith as expressed today. Where is African theology in this task? There are conflicting views, whereas some scholars in Africa, like the Africanist Matthew Scoffelias, assert that in comparison with other issues addressed by African theology, African Christological discourse remains in a sort of crisis, not showing much innovation. Veteran African theologian Charles Nyamiti holds the opposite view. Nyamiti argues that Christology is the subject which has been most developed in today's African theology. However, that may be, with rapid economic, political, and social changes in the continent, the Christological task is urgent. The question of naming Jesus is therefore one of the central concerns of the Christological endeavor in Africa. This is required in order to give him the character that corresponds to his African identity, to accord him a personality that incorporates him radically into the African community values. For this exercise to be genuine, we must pay attention to the foundations of human construction of meaning, whose dynamics include the use of symbols. For it is through symbols that people learn to make sense of their environment and much more so construct their spirituality and religious structures. Symbols play a great role in constructing religious structures. On account of the importance of the name as a foundational symbol in African ontology, it is necessary to give Jesus a new local name in Africa. The question that Jesus posed to his disciples concerning his identity in the Gospels is still relevant for African Christology today. What or who is Jesus in Africa? What or who is Jesus for Africa? This is a relevant question, an important question for Africa today, and it needs to be given a response, an answer. The answer that must be provided to this question must be situated in and emerge out of African central ontological and epistemological framework, the desire for abundant life. It is on this reality that a meaningful African Christology can be built. Scholars summarize the African notion of life in terms of several indispensable dimensions of relationships. First, the relationship with God and the ancestors, that is, relationship with transcendence. Secondly, relationship with the community and tradition, or corporate relationship. Thirdly, relationship with oneself and other individuals, or intra and interpersonal relationship. And relationship with creation, that is, one's dwelling place and things, which we can call spatial relationship. The Pulse of Life covers all of these relationships in Africa. They constitute the energy or force of life. Life can be sustained and nourished only through participation in these relationships, that is, in community. So, not that I think, therefore I am, but I am because we are. For African ontology, life is possible only in community, understood as a union of all the four dimensions just noted. Transcendence, other human beings, the self, and the rest of creation. These constitute the force for abundant life. These relationships with transcendence, with other human beings, with the self, and with the rest of creation constitute for Africans the force of abundant life. The accent is life lived to the full in Africa. If in African cultural religious epistemology life is the focus, it means that the way and the truth as Christological attributes are embedded in this ultimate end. In this sense, philosophical wisdom, the way, and scientific rationality, the truth, are taken to serve the definitive goal of life. In trying to decipher what life means for them, Africans have concentrated on its intrinsic purpose, which involves promoting harmonious relationships within oneself, the family, and the larger community. As one researcher in African culture, Benjamin Ray, explains, in the African perception, every person is the center of relationships between self, the world, and invisible powers that influence and are influenced by a person's behavior. The moral ideal is the harmonious integration of the self with society and the spiritual world. The intricate or the intricacies of relationships within this extended community determine the purpose of life and its full achievement. In African spirituality, there are certain social and ritual requirements to maintain this harmony essential for life's flourishing. Chief among them is marriage and procreation. So, how can Jesus insert himself in this African lexicon of life so that he becomes meaningful to the African psyche as the true Umuntu, the ultimate life giver? Of the several Christological hymns and passages in the New Testament, perhaps the best that addresses this quality of Jesus as Umuntu, as a real human being, is the Kenosis hymn in Paul's letter to the Philippians. This hymn exposes the context in which Jesus might be adequately named in Africa, because he's one of us and one with us. He is truly a member of the human community. His complete solidarity with humanity on the one hand and with God on the other renders him proficient in both languages, so to speak. So it is Jesus who speaks the language of God, and it is Jesus who speaks the language of humanity. It provides the key requirement, the kenosis thing provides the key requirement to visualize the utmost meaningful life, Jesus is God with us. Considered from the point of view of African epistemology, the doctrine of the incarnation reflects Jesus' inclusion into the human clan, evidenced by his birth into the clan of David. It is as a concrete human being that Jesus connects most deeply with the human reality. So the incarnation is very important in making Jesus one of us, making Jesus like us. In African terms, therefore, Jesus is truly a member of the human community who fully participates in it by bestowing on humanity fullness of life, by bestowing on humanity life-giving and life-enriching forces. As such, Jesus is the icon of the good life that every African desires. From the signs and wonders that he performed during his life, we can infer that Jesus is the divine grace for the community. He is God's invitation to humanity to enter into communion with all life-giving forces. Jesus Christ is the one who comes to bring us the fullness of God's life. Christ presents God as God for us, God at work for us, God in love with us. It is Christ that gives us those benefits from God. The Spirit of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, accompanying his disciples in this world, is that Spirit that gives eternal life. That's according to Paul. Now, even in this world, there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. And because you, believers, belong to him, by adhering to his life-giving word, the power of the life-giving Spirit has freed you from the power of sin that leads to death. In biblical Christology, Jesus as a healing figure is at the heart of the New Testament message. Jesus is healer in the New Testament. He is the unifier of all life-giving dynamics in the universe. This foundational principle and its related understanding of Jesus are deeply embedded also in African spirituality. Jesus as life giver. African spiritual consciousness is rooted in the conviction that all positive forces of life, including fecundity, sharing, love, wealth, health, and happiness, depend on and lead to flourishing of life. Thus, Jesus must be seen in Africa to be the personification of every form of living energy. Conversely, he represents the repudiation of every force that contradicts life, namely the negative energies of witchcraft, selfishness, envy, anger, and infertility in humans and nature. It is for this reason that Jesus becomes the ultimate life giver, the great healer. He supplies life by his word to everything that exists. This is why Jesus is the fulfillment of what it means to be human, in many African languages called Ubuntu, because his sole purpose is to make life flourish. He is the true peace advocate, the defender of harmony, without which there can be no authentic community. It is why African theologians like Charles Nyamiti spell out the role of Jesus in Africa as brother ancestor, another title that is given to Jesus by African theologians. Nyamiti argues that Jesus was conceived, lived, and died, and was exalted from death for the sake of humanity. What Jesus did between his birth and death was a foretaste of what he's doing now. In a more perfect and comprehensive way, he fosters the unity of humankind in love, something that he stood for and demonstrated in his earthly life. The public ministry of Jesus stressed the restoration and maintenance of unity and the celebration of life in very concrete ways. Social cohesion in love justice constitutes a pattern in every one of his signs that we read about in the New Testament. This is part and parcel of Jesus' life-giving mission. Theologians like Benezet Bujo propose the argument that if Jesus Christ is ancestor, or in Nyamiti's terms, brother ancestor, source of life and happiness, our task as individual Christians and as church is to bring to realization concretely the memory of his passion, death, and resurrection, making that saving event the criterion for judging human conduct. We do this by our ceaseless promotion of human rights and dignity, justice, reconciliation, and peace. So Jesus is not only a physical healer, Jesus is also a social healer. The salvation which Jesus brought must not be seen simply as a revelation of his divinity. Jesus emphasized that he came as Messiah in order to bring fullness of life at every level. Bujo points out that faith in Jesus is therefore genuine only if it is socially transformational. So faith in Jesus must transform society. In giving himself as food in the Eucharist to those who believe in him, Jesus becomes the life-giving race which flows into all of his descendants, the true life force which Africa has always been seeking. Therefore, the African community, clan, or nation can only develop by participating in the proto-life of Jesus. At the same time, individuals can only help their communities to grow when they remain grounded in Jesus, the living sap, which is the unique source of life for the whole mystical body, that is, the church. Thus, social disharmony brought about by injustice and conflict is a denial of the abundant life of Christ. When the church, as Jesus' visible agent, fails to bridge and heal rifts in society, she compromises both his identity as comprehensive healer and his message of integral healing. Jesus' affirmation of the African understanding of life notwithstanding, it cannot be denied that some aspects of Jesus' life understood superficially are highly irregular and would not quite commend him as healer, let alone as comprehensive life giver, and therefore as ancestor in the African worldview. I want to mention three of these that stand out as crucial. We cannot avoid discussing them. The first one concerns Jesus' perpetual unmarried state, is celibacy. So that marriage is an important ritual that promotes life in Africa. But Jesus was celibate. How then can he be a life giver, a healer? The second aspect has to do with his lack of material possessions, his comparative poverty. And the third relates to his horrible death by crucifixion. These are problematic. They are facts about Jesus' life, but in African eyes, they are very problematic. To begin with, because marriage and procreation are central aspects in the African dance of life, it follows that the notion of the lifelong celibacy of Jesus, freely chosen for that matter, appears to contradict the very foundations of African ontology, including the notion of life and personhood, the prospect of immortality, the relationship with God and the ancestors, the social ideals of total community of the living and the dead, and the socio-economic advantages considered necessary for life in the world. If, therefore, willful lifelong celibacy is abhorrent in the African spiritual perspective, how can celibate Jesus be considered to be the promoter of life as well as its exemplar during his earthly existence and an ancestor, actually the proto-ancestor of all human beings in his afterlife? How can it be? Not being married is a barrier in African spirituality to becoming an ancestor, but Jesus was celibate. How can he be considered to be an ancestor? How can he be considered to be a life giver? Second problem is that if life is promoted also by material possessions in the African perspective, how can Jesus, a relatively poor man, be associated with life's fulfillment? You cannot escape that question. Finally, if natural death in ripe old age constitutes the ideal characteristic for ancestorship, how can Jesus' death on the cross, a bad death, be considered a life-giving force rather than a curse? I'd like us to briefly address these issues about Jesus in terms of calling him healer, or in terms of calling him life giver. Jesus counteracted the contemporary, largely biological understanding of fecundity by underlining the sense of fecundity generated by genuine love. In his life, Jesus does not emphasize physical fecundity, as the ultimate goal, but the fecundity that is generated by love. The power of God, which Jesus represents, is not limited to physical offspring. Rather, it is divine, it is a divine vital energy which offers an ending life of communion with others and God to everyone who receives Him. Life continues transformed after death. There is, in the mind of Jesus, an eschatological finality to the meaning of physical life, one that is obtained by choosing radical goodness, one that is obtained by choosing radical love. Ancestorship based on self-giving service to the welfare of others is also true ancestorship. And the life of Jesus is an example of this true ancestorship. His whole life was dedicated to service, to the service of others. We cannot but agree with Edward Shorter, an Africanist theologian, on this point, that Jesus' celibate condition emphasized his complete life-generating union with God, his sacred character. In this quality of Jesus, God's benevolence could be discerned as totally present. Jesus' humanity constituted the defining model of what it means to be human. His life was completely geared towards the building of community. As Shorter explains, Jesus shared his daily life with others, including with women, a radical countercultural stance of his day. He sat at table with them and shared food with them. He identified with the poor in their lack of possessions and in their insecurity. This attitude in action of Jesus was a form of self-deprivation for a higher good, the practice of universal self-forgetting love. And this is what qualified Jesus as ancestor, or qualifies him as ancestor, even in African eyes. Jesus' celibacy is a witness today in Africa that the fecundity of consecrated celibacy transcends the limits of biological reproduction. Celibacy is spiritually and socially fertile. It teaches people how to love and how to live. It instills in people respect of self and respect for others. Celibacy, well understood and practiced, is creative in countless ways. It frees people for innumerable kinds of service to the community: spiritual, pastoral, catechetical, educational, medical, social, and so on. To all these types of service, it imparts a spirit of dedication and single-mindedness which makes them deeply appreciated. Concerning the poverty of Jesus, St. Paul writes, "Though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich." The question is, of course, how this can happen. The response is simply through unfeigned generosity, through complete sharing, even the sharing of one's life for the sake of others, as Jesus demonstrated. The incarnation of Jesus bespeaks of this kind of self-giving love on the part of Jesus, as does the entire ministry of Jesus. Jesus describes this in other instances as poverty of spirit or purity of heart, ascribing to this attitude eternal life in the kingdom of God. St. Paul explains the goal of this to be social egalitarianism. The goal of self-giving love, or the sense of poverty in the gospel, is social egalitarianism. That those who gathered a lot had nothing left over, and those who gathered only a little had enough. We find in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 15. Of course, this was the structure of the early church, as we all know. The final very serious paradox concerns the death of Jesus. The book of Deuteronomy reflects the African idea that the manner of death, such as Jesus underwent on the cross, was a curse. However, St. Paul argues that by his crucifixion, Jesus reversed the curse of a shameful death into a blessing for humanity and the entire earth. St. Paul argues that Christ has rescued us from the curse pronounced by the law. When he was hung on the cross, he took upon himself the curse for our wrongdoing. And Jesus himself is unambiguous about the communion of life he brings about by his supposedly shameful death. And he says, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will bring everyone, or I draw everyone to myself and give them life. By shedding his blood on the cross for the world, Jesus gave life to the world. He liberated it from every enslaving law and regulation. His mission was to open the universe to God alone. This is perhaps the central message of the New Testament, but that by his death, Jesus opened the universe to God. One finds a further eloquent depiction of the meaning of the salvific role of Jesus' death on the cross in the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 53, verses 4 to 11, about the Messiah. The prophet foretells that even though we thought wrongly that Jesus' troubles were punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins, it was our weaknesses that he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. The prophet says, referring to Jesus, that he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins, he was beaten so that we could be whole, he was whipped so that we could be healed. No one cared that he died without descendants, that his life was cut short in midstream, that he was struck down for the rebellion of my people. He had done no wrong and had never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave. Yet when his life is made an offering for sin, we will have many descendants. When his life is made an offering for sin, we will have many descendants. We will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. When he seeks all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. So the manner of Jesus' death is significant for African Christology. In African symbology, blood, in its many manifestations, such as human milk, saliva, and so on, is the ultimate sign of life, and it must not be needlessly wasted. Nevertheless, the voluntary exchange of blood between individuals establishes an unbreakable bond of relationship with very serious implications if the relationship thus established is broken. Exchange of blood implies the demand to give up one's life for the other if necessary. So by his death, Jesus emptied himself for humankind. Through the humiliation of the cross, he shared his body and blood with us. This is what he does in the Eucharist, so that the world may live. Jesus Christ gives himself to us in the Eucharist, so that the world may live. So Jesus seemingly bad death on the cross is therefore more than offset by his willful act of giving up everything for the sake of his brothers and sisters, pouring out his blood for them. It is this act that has gained for him innumerable relations, namely everyone who obeys God and does what is right, thereby making him proto-ancestor or ancestor par excellence of humankind. He is the ultimate advocate for life. He is humanity's elder brother. He is the great healer. He is the ultimate life giver. It is significant in Africa that the followers of Jesus are called Christians. Very significant. African theologians note that if a descendant is named after his or her ancestor, the ancestor continues to live in this descendant. When a child is named in honor of an ancestor, the ancestor lives on and is entitled to regular communication with the descendant through prayers, ritual offerings, and libations. The ancestor, on his or her part, is expected also to procure benefits for his living kin, such as health, material wealth, long life, and the begetting of children as a reward for their ritual communication with him. This is the relationship that exists between Jesus as ancestor with his Christian descendants, with the church, indeed with all those who do the will of God. As God-man or God-human, by shedding his blood on the cross for humankind, Jesus earned this entitlement in the absolute sense. All other ancestors of humankind only share in the ancestorship of Jesus. The church is important, the perpetuation of the legacy of Jesus Christ. We cannot have a Christology without an ecclesiology. The church is important as the perpetuation of the legacy of Jesus Christ. The words and actions of the ancestors, particularly the words uttered at their deathbed, occupy a very prominent place in any African community's grammar of life. These words and actions become normative tradition. They constitute words of life, setting the seal on the experiences and an example of one who, while withdrawing from the community, yet truly lives on within it. At death, when the ancestors or the elder utters words of advice, they become tradition, so that even though he leaves this world, he is actually present in his words. The words of ancestors constitute a rule of conduct for the living, and they must be continually repeated. The present and the future depend on this repetition and representation of past speech, actions, and rituals. It is in truth a matter of life and death. In the words and wishes of the ancestors, the past is enshrined in the tradition of the fathers, but it is a past which still lives and is the guarantee of present salvation. The representation of the past in a kind of memorial calendar is no mere pious ineffectual remembrance, but a necessary return to the source of life, which is essential if men and women are to be able to take a decisive step forward. Assuming the identity of Jesus, the church becomes a community of healing. If the church truly assumes the identity of Jesus, she becomes a community of healing. It becomes an instrument that assures the world that in Christ there is no more death, there is no more tears or pain or sorrow. By naming Jesus as healer in Africa, this becomes the central message of African Christology. When Jesus Christ is named as healer, it says there is no more pain, there should be no pain, there shouldn't be no more suffering, there should be no more tears, and ultimately no more death. God's clan, that is the church, founded on Jesus' vital force, will continue to vivify the human race and the whole of creation by doing what is right, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God. In this commitment of the church consists the way and the truth that lead to life. So the way and the truth are there to serve life. And when Jesus Christ identifies himself as the way, the truth, and the life, he says that the way and the truth should serve this ultimate end, which is to bring life to humanity and to bring life in its fullness. Thank you very much.
So the spirituality that you're describing, how much of your message is actually down at the pulpit level to people in the churches?
Although priests and preachers may not actually address this issue of Jesus as healer in the exact terms or similar terms that have described it, it's there among the people. People consider Jesus as healer. It's now beginning to be articulated, as I say, by African theologians, how much it is on the ground, consciously. It's a good question, but unconsciously people consider Jesus as healer. And in practice, really, where Jesus is considered as healer and is shown to be as healer, people appreciate this, Christians appreciate this, and this is very evident in Pentecostal churches, where the emphasis is on healing, Jesus the healer, the Spirit of Jesus is healer. People flock there. And in the Catholic Church, where this is not very much emphasized openly, then we have a problem. I've been in the parish for long time, more than 20 years. And these people, these old people, ladies and men, they come to church every Sunday. You see them every Sunday, but for a month you don't see them. And then they come back, and you ask them, "Where were you?" Said, "My grandchild was sick. I took them to the Pentecostal church. They prayed over the child. Now he's healed. I'm coming back to my own church." Yeah, they will tell you that, and they don't see anything, wrong about that. They don't see anything discordant about that, because healing, health, is the central issue. Another example which took place some years ago was this catechist. Many years ago, it was forbidden to Africans to consult a herbalist. It was quite forbidden by the church. But there was this catechist whose child was sick. It was also a grandchild was sick, and they had tried everything, hospitals and so on. The child was not healed, and so he took the child to the herbalist, and the child, became well. The parish priest came to hear about this, and they called a meeting of catechists, and you see, trying to convince the catechist that he should be dismissed. So there was a long debate, and so finally an old catechist at the bar raised up his hand and said, asked the priest, "Father, did you want this child to die or to live?" And the priest says, "What a stupid question. Of course I wanted him to live." And the catechist says, "So what's the problem? The child is alive." So the priest was looking at things on the level of doctrine. The catechists were looking at it on the level of preserving life. So unconsciously, instinctively, that feeling is there, even though, in articulation, maybe we ministers have not been able to do that. But the experience is quite clear in the experience of the Pentecostal churches. People just go because they emphasize the healing aspect. of Jesus, whereas we are not quite there in the Catholic Church, at least in Africa. I don't know about North America.
Thank you.
Hello, Pastor. So my question was, what do you think we can do as a Catholic Church to bring this teaching about, to heal as the Pentecostals do, as Protestants do? What can we do to emphasize that? So instead of some charismatic Catholics actually emphasize that themselves. What would be your advice, your thinking, to bring that more alive and promote it and stuff like that?
The short answer to that question is that we should do it. We should begin to emphasize the importance of healing, the importance of Jesus Christ as healer, the importance of the Spirit of Jesus Christ as healer. And I think in the Catholic Church we should be also humble and learn from other churches, from other Christian churches, who emphasize that aspect of Jesus Christ, as I said, who emphasize that aspect of healing Jesus Christ. So sometimes we are very shy in the Catholic Church, even with Pentecostal, with charismatic groups in the Catholic Church. Where I come from, sometimes we are very shy. We don't want them. I think we in the Catholic Church emphasize too much the element of control. We want things to be controlled, and we want just things to be so. And if things get out of shape, as we would say, then we don't like that. So, but the Spirit, who can control the Spirit? I mean, the Spirit grows wherever she wills. I'm not saying that it is easy for an institution such as the Catholic Church, which is concerned with order. It's not easy, but I think that we should. It's important for us to learn also from other churches that this aspect of our faith is really very, very important. In Africa, if you started a church, as Africans, many Africans have started churches, and you emphasize that aspect of healing, next Sunday, your yard will be full of people. There is, well, in the parish that I was working, there's one Sunday where we have a healing mass. That's the most frequented Sunday of all the Sundays of the year. People come from everywhere because they need healing. And who of us does not need healing? I mean, people emphasize physical healing, but there is spiritual healing, there's psychological healing, there are all sorts. We are all, I'm sorry to say, but we are all sick in one way or another. And we need the healing of Jesus Christ. So I'm not trying to be glib, but my answer to your question is that we should begin doing it. And we should, of course, the problem lies in the training of ministers, where we don't emphasize that aspect. In fact, we train our ministers to control things rather than to liberate the Spirit. So the training for me is crucial, and I've been involved in training seminaries for a long time, but it's a very important question. How do we train the ministers of the gospel, train our priests and sisters and so on?
Thank you, Professor Makam. Just to say something about the question you asked, and I think coming from an African perspective too, just to add that I think theology is the lived experiences of people. And I think the concept of Jesus Christ being a healer is actually the lived experience of people desiring healing. So it is not something that should come from top down. It is something that should come from the real experience of people, and that, like professional theologians like you, can help clarify and then bring scripture into it. I have two questions. My first question has to do with, we talked about wholeness, the African desire of wholeness. And one thing we talk about is a relationship and sharing being part of that essential, relationship, and that is a value in Africa. How do you reconcile that with the experience of, especially in the political, field where you have individuals amassing wealth, refusing to share resources, and they don't care about what the poverty people are going through. How do you reconcile that with the real value of sharing that bring wholeness in the African? The second question is, obviously I know Africa is a very big continent, and many people do not know that Africa is not a country. It's a continent, and I'm very, sometimes I don't take kindly to people who have failed to read their geography. So to what extent can we really talk about knowing the diversity in Africa? Africa is a continent that is very, very diverse, religiously, culturally. To what extent can we really talk about African theology with specific reference to rights and many other aspects?
Thank you very much. With regard to your first question, the things that are happening in Africa that really contradict the values, the cultural values that I've been talking about, sharing and so on and so forth. It's really a paradox, but it is a paradox that can be explained. First of all, what is community in traditional African society? What is community? And it still appears it appears a lot. I work in Kenya, I come from Tanzania, but I work in Kenya. Community is my clan. Community is my people. I think what Jesus Christ brings for us is to expand that idea of community. Community is everyone. But we still are really embedded in the idea of community as my people. You see that in Kenya. A politician is caught stealing. But, and if action is taken against him or her, the people where he comes from say, you are victimizing our son. You are victimizing our daughter. So what is the sense of community? I'm talking about African culture not as a perfect culture. No culture is perfect. It has its own flaws, and that is one of the flaws that we must address, especially as a church. That in Jesus Christ there is no Jew or Greek, we are all one in Christ. Well, African culture falls short, especially in politics, and many other things fall short in considering everybody as part of my community. And it's not only Africa, throughout the world, that's why Jesus Christ comes to bring us together as one. So I think we should work on that. Not I think, we must work on that. And seeing the countries that have succeeded in Africa are those countries where politicians have tried really hard to build the nation, build that sense of nationhood. That I'm not this tribe or this tribe, but we are all members of one nation. So I'm trying to explain that paradox where the culture really values community, but you see these things happening in other tribes, other ethnic groups being discriminated against. I think it's that narrowness of the conception of what community is. And I think we should work in Africa to expand that. And our idea, our conception of Jesus Christ should be something that will help us to do that. The second question, that comes up all the time. In fact, people ask, what is Africa? With so many tribes, so many cultures, and so on and so forth. But I always ask people, if you don't want to speak about African culture or African religion, why do you speak about African? Why do you speak about Christianity in the singular without any problem? But there are so many Christianities for us. So many Christians. Some fight against one another. But we have no problem about speaking Christianity or even Islam. But when it comes to Africa, they're not so diverse that you cannot speak about Africa as one, you cannot speak about African culture, you cannot speak about African religion. The question is what aspects you want to emphasize. If you want to emphasize the differences, of course, you can speak about African cultures. You can speak about many Africans. But if you want to speak about the things that are similar, it is possible to speak about African culture. I've been to countries far away from Tanzania, where I come from, and I have witnessed the rituals, and I ask myself, where did these people get this from? Did it come from my country or not? But there was no contact at all. So there are so many similarities in African culture, African customs, to warrant talking about African culture in the singular. But there are also differences. So for personally, I have no problem if you want to emphasize, to talk about African cultures, as long as you tell me that you are emphasizing the differences. I have no problem talking about African culture in the singular or African religion in the singular, as long as you are emphasizing the similarities. And I think this is true of every. Is there an American culture, for example? Is there? I'm asking you this. Is there something called American culture? Okay, no point once. But you know, what do you want to emphasize? That's the crucial question here. But the question comes up all the time. It is a fair question. It's a fair question, but sometimes I think it's exaggerated to emphasize the differences in Africa. But Africa also, in spite of it having many countries, 54, 55, and many cultures, and so it has also similarities that warrant speaking about African culture in singular. And that's what I've emphasized in my career. Talking about African theology, I talk about African theology in the singular. I talk about African religion in the singular because I want to emphasize the similarities. I don't ignore the differences, but I think the similarities are very important as well. Thank you very much.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. There's a good friend of mine, a doctor who works in the liberated area of the Sudan, in an area called the Middle Mountains. And last year, Nicholas Kristof, who's a well-known editorialist of the New York Times, he had been up there visiting, and he wrote an article, one of his op-eds in the New York Times. The title of it was, "Is Jesus Christ?" And so he just kind of talked about this doctor, his name is Tom, and at the very end he said that he was talking with a Muslim man up there, and he said, "Well, what do you think about Dr. Tom?" And the man's response was, "He's Jesus Christ." And so Kristof says to him, "Well, why is that?" And he says, "Because he heals people." And I think that's very much what you're talking about there.
Thank you.
Hello. All right. My question is, why is it important to label Jesus as healer in Africa when there's like sangomas and like herbal doctors that also heal? Why is what's different when it comes to Jesus being labeled like a healer in Africa?
Because the symbols that we have used in the church, in Christian churches, do not make sense to Africa. Redeemer, Messiah. They don't make sense. People will accept it. You say, okay, Jesus is Redeemer, Messiah. What does that mean actually? That's why I said that naming Jesus using local symbols, giving Jesus a local name is very important if Jesus is to be understood and his ministry is to be really appreciated. And I propose the symbol of healer because people know exactly what the healer does for people. Instead of using the traditional, those traditional symbols, as I said, I think I mentioned it, are important, the scriptural symbols, but there were symbols that were used in their own context. The symbols that made sense in a specific cultural and context and time. But for many Africans, Messiah, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus as what's the other titles of Jesus, Christological titles, Savior. You know, they really don't make much sense. And so this symbol, this title, Jesus as healer, really makes a difference to people because they know what. And I said that people construct rationality from what they know. We are experiencing snow right now. The hardest thing I've had to explain where I come from is what snow is. I've spent hours trying to explain what snow is. And people just look at you and think, what are you talking about? Because the physical environment does not provide those symbols. But then I'm really surprised at myself that I turn around and pray, oh Lord, make me as white as snow. In that context. It doesn't make sense. Isn't there another symbol that would really explain the meaning of this prayer in the Psalms? Psalm 91, I think, which is purity, make me pure. Isn't there another symbol in the culture that people would relate to, that would explain that concept? Do we have to use the symbol of snow? I mean, I could go further. This is very controversial, but I'll mention it anyway. Even the symbols that we use as Eucharistic species, they're very problematic in certain aspects. In Turkana and Kenya, I say wine, is people haven't, now maybe everybody has seen bread, but is bread food really? It depends on your theology of the Eucharist as well. Is it a feast, is it food? I've heard people from my own village who visited other people and they served them bread and tea and they came back and so on. Because Africans will always ask, did you eat that? And people said, no, I didn't eat anything. They gave me bread and tea. So bread and tea is not food. But we really use this, I think I'm not saying that life is a very complicated thing, but I think that the church in Africa cannot avoid thinking about the question is hypothetical question, highly hypothetical question. If Jesus had been born in Turkana today, would he have used bread and wine as symbols of the Eucharist? But at the Last Supper, would he have used bread and wine? I don't know. It's it's a hypothetical question, but we make these symbols perpetual to apply to every part of the world. So I think that these symbols are very, very important. The names that we call Jesus, the symbols that we use to describe Jesus are very important if Christianity, if the message of Jesus Christ has to make sense in the context where it is preached. We use water as a symbol of blessing. Among some people in Africa, water, sprinkling water on somebody is a curse. Use milk. So symbols are really, we take them without too much, giving them too much thought. That they walking hand in hand on the streets of my village, a man, a husband and wife walking hand in hand is a negative sign. It's not positive at all, it's not a sign of love. You walk separately. Now is that, people would call that all kinds of names and so on and so forth, descriptions, but it's a cultural symbol that makes sense to people that are very, and I would say that Christianity has failed to make as deep roots in Africa as it should, because it has not paid attention to the cultural symbols, the wrong symbols that people use. So people are quite great. Africans are very polite. They always, to a superior, they will always say, yes, Father, very good, and so on. But they will go and do their own thing. You find that in the funerals. I use the Catholic ritual funerals. Do it very well and so on, and you finish, and people will just wait. They won't leave. They'll just wait, say the rosary and so on. You will get hungry and go to have your tea. Once you leave, they will make their own rituals. And it's going on until today. And you tell them, but why? They say, because they think that the Catholic ritual, using the Catholic ritual alone, this person has not been buried properly. So what prevents us as a church in Africa from learning? What is it lacking? What is lacking in our Catholic rituals that we can borrow from the people's rituals that do not contradict our faith? And I don't think that everything they do contradicts our faith as Christians. But that's missionary church structures, church thinking is still very prevalent in Africa, and I think it needs to be re-examined.
My question is more to the positive aspect of the African Christianity in Africa. I know earlier you mentioned that there is no Christology without ecclesiology. And it does make sense. But my question is, when you go around different parts of the world, there are some places that Christianity used to be big and not anymore. There's culture and tradition that's in a decline when it comes to Christianity. And comparing to how Africa is doing right now, since especially you are working there right now, at least as far as I know, it's not really declining in Africa. Christianity is still flourishing, vocation is still going well, and Christianity is still going strong. My question is, what do you think that's the reason, if that's so? And also if there is anything that we, people that are living outside Africa, if there is anything that we can learn so that Christianity can grow stronger and can flourish. Thank you.
I don't know what other places can learn from Africa. One thing I would suggest is not to make Christianity only an intellectual thing, a matter of doctrine and belief and so on, but life, in positive life. Christianity is life. That's why in Africa, in traditional Africa, there's no distinction between religion and culture. There's no name for religion. It's life. And I think we have emphasized too much also the doctrine, the intellectual knowledge of Christianity at the expense of living it out. That I would hesitantly say is one of the things that perhaps African Christianity can teach the world. You can see that also in worship in Africa. It's real life. It's a celebration of life. Friends come and visit and say, at Mass, seeing these people dancing and ululating and so on. Say, were you really praying? So praying for them is, certain positions and so on, and like the dance and so on. Maybe making Christianity as life is very important. Not neglecting, of course, the doctrinal part, the teaching part, but life is life. Why is Christianity growing in Africa and Asia, in fact? And the global South, Christianity is growing than the global North. For Africa, I would go with one of the theologians saying that Africans are notoriously religious. The name animism to describe African religion has been taken negatively. I don't take it negatively at all. Animism. But everything has life. Everything has its own life and has to be. So everything is religious. My latest book, as Stan mentioned, is what is not sacred. That division between sacred and secular is not there in African spirituality. Everything is sacred and must be respected as such. And maybe this notoriety of African being, religious is what is making Christianity, as well as other faiths. It's not only Christianity that's growing, Islam is also growing. And there are numerous churches being born every day in Africa, called African initiated churches. They're being born every day. I think it grows from that aspect of African life as being religious, as having no distinction between the secular and secular, that everything is religious. And when Christianity brings with it other benefits, it's an added bonus, education, health services and so on, is that many people are converted in Africa to Christianity because of this benefit. So everything that enhances life is good. And African people will be attracted to that. The more life is brought, the more vital force is seen, the more people are attracted to that kind of religion.
Yes, thank you for coming here again. I grew up Pentecostal, so it's interesting that you mentioned Pentecostal, so it's been a very different experience coming into the Catholic Church, and there were a lot of various other things that I explored before coming Catholic. And I would have to agree that there is this excellent theology and philosophy, that I find in Catholicism, and today's the Feast of Thomas Aquinas that goes back to that excellent theological tradition. But I do see that gap, having grown up Pentecostal, as far as that energy and that desire to really live out that supernatural life, and not just having in a special little compartment for Sunday Mass that people, and it feels like they're having their teeth pulled to come to the Sunday Mass, and it doesn't really inform what goes on in the rest. So I think like in Western civilization, among, Europeans and Caucasians, there's been this secularization where the secular is life, and it's like the church is off somewhere in this little itty bitty corner, and so it's not something that really calls out to you that's very vital, except maybe on your deathbed, and, because then I guess you begin to learn about the supernatural whether you want to or not. So I found what you said interesting. Like, it seems like there is that spirituality in African culture for what encounters that I've had with it, because I did encounter like a traditional African religious group before converting, and when I thought about many of the things you said, I would see it like a proto-evangelism before coming into the Catholic Church, and I do see that there's this implicit supernatural life, but is there a decision, to really live it out, is more of the question here in the West. And I do see the African priests coming here, and they are on fire, and they have the charismatic gifts, and and I hear them on the radio, and I'm thinking, I think more African Americans would be persuaded to come into the Catholic Church if they experience this, rather than a certain type of coldness, or lack of zeal, and a lack of community, or even a lack of welcome.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for one, maybe two questions. We shouldn't go past 8 o'clock. But
hi, I'm James. Nice to meet you. I think my question is more on the local level. I think Chicago is known for its diversity, and we see a lot of the church from Africa come here, primarily from Nigeria, Kenya, and Beye, different places in the east and the west. How do we meet our brothers and sisters in our congregations when there is this element of just knowing Jesus through word and through these different symbols? How do we meet them here, where there's such a westernized method of engaging Christ in the church through the Eucharist? And you mentioned that you have these different ways of emphasizing that in the African church, but how can we meet that group here in Chicago? I think that's my question.
can't answer that. Maybe I should ask Stan to address that, or anybody else. Because I haven't lived in the city long. I've just come. I came 1 week ago. Anybody would like to help us address that? Because it's a genuine question. It's important question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also new in the United States. I must admit, this is my second year, so I spent most of the last 10 years in Canada, and yeah, I think is a legitimate problem, is a legitimate challenge. But I think the United States Conference of Bishops, they have an office for migrants, as well as there's also a small office within that also dealing specifically with African migrants here. And one of the person who started that office is a Nigerian nun who is also here in Chicago. I mean, more could be done, but I think there is a consciousness about this gap. And, you know, I notice a lot of Nigerians who are here, as well as in Toronto, they go to Pentecostal churches. I mean, they will bring their children for baptism in the Catholic Church, but then on Sundays, they go to the Pentecostal churches. Even my closest friends, you know, they say to me, you know, it's not fun going to church, you know, when the priest is white. So I don't know. So I call it some kind of ecclesial tribalism of a sort, also that we should be conscious of. So I think it's a problem that also the bishops are addressing the problem. Here in the United States, there is the congregation for the Josephites. You know, they were set up specifically to minister to African Americans. That's their mission. So they have many parishes. They have many parishes all over. But there also, again, it also needs to be pointed out that there are, like here in Chicago, there is a Nigerian Catholic ministry. I don't know if there is Kenya. There's Mass in Swahili. No. In Toronto, there is one. That's what I know, that we have a Swahili Mass just to address this. But also, there is always the danger of, I call it again, ecclesial tribalism. You know, if we are a Catholic Church, you know, there's need also. If you like to eat, you know, a sausage, maybe sometimes you try hamburger. You know, maybe the same way spiritually. So that's what I can say.
Thank you everyone for coming.